In the 13th century, the world did not end with a whisper, it ended with the thunder of hooves. To the sedentary civilizations of Europe, the Middle East and China, the concept of war was understood through a lens of walls, heavy armor, and established rules of engagement. Kings and emperors, resting comfortably in their stone fortresses, believed their fortifications made them invincible, and that the wild, unknown lands of the East held no threat capable of toppling the great pillars of civilization. They were catastrophically wrong. Out of the silence of the Mongolian steppe came a force so fast, so brutal, and so alien in its methodology that those who witnessed it believed they were being punished by the Almighty himself. These were the Mongols, and in less than a single lifetime, they conquered more land than Rome managed to subdue in 1,000 years. But this was not merely a barbarian horde swarming over the horizon. It was the most sophisticated, disciplined, and ruthless military machine the world had ever seen. To understand why they were impossible to stop, one must first understand that the Mongols were waging a completely different kind of war, one for which the rest of the world had no answer. The invincibility of the Mongol army began not with the sword, but with the horse. For the armies of Europe or the Crusader states, war was a logistical nightmare, a slow-moving beast tethered to baggage trains, ox carts, and supply lines that stretched back to the homeland. An army traveled on its stomach, and when the food stopped, the army stopped. The Mongols shattered this limitation. They were the only army in history composed entirely of cavalry, and they moved with a fluidity that mocked the rigid, lumbering legions of the West. Every Mongol warrior rode with a string of 3 or 4 horses. When one mount tired, he would leap to another mid-gallop, allowing the horde to cover up to 100 miles in a single day, a speed that to their enemies appeared indistinguishable from teleportation. They required no supply lines, for the steppe had taught them to survive on nothing. They drank the blood of their horses if water ran dry. They ate dried curd, and they hunted as they marched. While European commanders were paralyzed waiting for grain shipments to navigate muddy roads, the Mongols were already circling behind them, cutting off their escape and tightening the noose. They were ghosts. You could not catch them, you could not outrun them, and you certainly could not hide from them. Yet speed alone does not conquer empires. One needs firepower, and the Mongols possessed the assault rifle of the Middle Ages, the Recurve composite bow. Constructed from a complex laminate of horn, wood, and sinew, and cured over months of painstaking labor, this weapon had a draw weight of over 160 pounds, rivaling the famous English longbow, but compact enough to be fired from the saddle. A Mongol warrior, trained from the moment he could walk to ride and shoot, could loose arrows with sniper-like precision while galloping at full speed. He could fire forward, sideways, and even backward, the famous Parthian shot, turning a retreat into a deadly offensive. When facing the heavy knights of Europe, who relied on the crushing weight of the shock charge, the Mongols simply refused to be there when the hammer fell. They stayed just out of reach, raining armor-piercing death upon knights who were too slow to close the distance and too proud to retreat. The Mongols did not fight for honor, they fought to win. This pragmatic approach to warfare gave birth to their most devastating tactic, the feigned retreat. Western chivalry and samurai codes were built on the idea of bold, forward momentum, but the Mongols preyed on this aggression. In battle, the Mongol vanguard would engage, fire a volley, and then suddenly break formation, screaming and fleeing in apparent panic. To the arrogant knight or the confident general, this looked like victory. Seeing the barbarians run, the disciplined lines of the enemy would shatter as they broke rank to chase down the fleeing nomads, their heavy horses tiring as they galloped across the plains. It was a seduction into death. Once the enemy was strung out, disorganized, and exhausted, a signal horn would blow, and the panicked Mongols would wheel around in unison. Fresh heavy lancers would emerge from the flanks, and the trap would snap shut. The hunters became the hunted, surrounded and annihilated in a storm of arrows and steel. They didn't just lose battles, they were erased from the map. Victims of a discipline that allowed the Mongols to simulate chaos while maintaining perfect control. However, the true genius of Genghis Khan and his successors lay in their adaptability. Historically, nomadic armies broke upon the stone walls of great cities, lacking the technology to breach fortifications. But Genghis Khan was not a dogmatic traditionalist. He was the ultimate pragmatist. If he conquered an enemy, he did not just plunder their gold, he harvested their minds. When the Mongols invaded China, they captured engineers. When they invaded Persia, they captured siege experts. Within years, the army that had lived in felt tents was constructing the most advanced trebuchets, catapults, and siege engines the world had ever seen. They weaponized gunpowder before Europe even understood its properties. They diverted rivers to flood resistant cities, and they hurled the bodies of plague victims over walls to wage biological warfare. Furthermore, the Mongol army was a strict meritocracy. In the feudal West, one led an army because of their bloodline. In the Mongol Horde, one led because they were competent. A shepherd could rise to become a general if he showed tactical brilliance. This ensured that the Mongol leadership was always the absolute best the empire had to offer, a sharp contrast to the inbred and incompetent aristocracy of their rivals. Speed, tactics, and technology were the limbs of the Mongol beast, but its heart was a weapon of pure psychology, terror. Genghis Khan offered the world a binary choice: surrender and serve, or resist and die. There was no middle ground, and he made sure the consequences of resistance were so horrific that the sheer rumor of his approach would cause cities to capitulate. When the city of Nishapur revolted and killed the Khan's son-in-law, the response was not merely a punishment, it was an extermination. Every man, woman, child, and even the dogs and cats were slaughtered, and pyramids of severed heads were erected outside the city walls as a grim monument to Mongol wrath. This was not mindless savagery. It was a cold, calculated strategy to save Mongol lives. As news of these atrocities spread along the Silk Road, fear did the work for them. Entire provinces surrendered without a single arrow being fired, understanding that the Mongols were not fighting for land, they were fighting for total submission. For a brief, violent moment in history, the East and the West were not divided. They were crushed together under the hoof of the Mongol pony. The cost of this unification was apocalyptic. It is estimated that 40 million people perished during the Mongol conquests, a percentage of the global population so high that the forests grew back over abandoned farmland and the carbon levels of the earth actually cooled. But in the wake of the fire, something new emerged. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, stabilized the largest contiguous empire in human history. A merchant could walk from Italy to China with a gold plate on his head and never be molested. Gunpowder, paper money, printing, and the compass traveled west along these secure roads, and the Renaissance of Europe was in many ways fertilized by the ashes left by the Khans. They were impossible to stop because they were the future crashing into the past, a force of nature that cleared the dead wood of the old world to make way for the new. History is often written by the victors, but in the 13th century, history wasn't written. It was forged in the fire of the steppe. And the world we live in today, with its interconnected trade and global exchange, is built on the bones they left behind.